Mpirical provide compelling, interactive learning across a range of delivery options. Live on site, live online, or online anytime, we have a training course that is ideal for you. For a no-obligations chat about your training requirements, contact us at mpirical.com.
Hello and welcome back to this series on strategic thinking. In this session, we're going to look at one of my favourite techniques, which is something called the VRIO framework. But before we get into the VRIO framework, we just need to take a moment to talk about competencies and resources. Let's begin with resources. So resources could be tangible, such as the network. They could be intangible, such as your spectrum, and they also include human resources. On the competency side, these are simply the things that a company does. We can define it as this: the activities and processes through which a company deploys its resources. Now, what's interesting from a company perspective is that there are some resources and some competencies that a company has to have and things it has to do simply to survive. We call these threshold competencies and threshold resources. But in order to create competitive advantage, a company needs to either have some form of unique resource or some form of core competency which allows it to create competitive advantage. And so the VRIO framework is a powerful tool for trying to uncover and explore what those core competencies and unique resources might be. The VRIO framework stands for things that are valuable, rare, imitable, and whether or not the organisation exploits it. So for something to be able to create competitive advantage, it needs to have value. But it also needs to be rare. Other competitors can't have it. And in order to provide sustainable competitive advantage, it needs to be costly for other competitors to replicate or imitate. And then finally, if it meets all of those three criteria, it's only going to develop and deliver shareholder value if the company exploits it effectively. So how do you apply the VRIO framework? Well, the first step is simply to list all of the resources and competencies that your business has. And here is a typical list of the sorts of things that my clients will come up with when I ask them to perform this exercise. So of course there's usually spectrum, their brand, network, distribution. Sometimes we talk about roaming partners. You'll usually see the customer base in there, and sometimes if they've got a fixed or converged business, the fixed network as well. So what we're going to do is apply the VRIO framework to this list here. Now, the way I set up my analysis, every single one of these resources or competencies is valuable. By the way I've defined it. So everything gets a tick, everything gets the word yes. So the next question is, to what extent is it rare? So to what extent is it uncommon? You are one of the only or few operators that has this resource or competency. And it's here that we start to see some of the challenges facing the industry. Because most regulators have sought to ensure that operators have similar levels of spectrum, and their networks are built often by the same vendors, and they're all operating to the same standards and have adopted similar distribution strategies, you often find that the only three things that are described as rare are brand, the customer base, and if you've got a fixed and converged mobile business and a fixed business, then possibly that area as well. And there's even some questions about how rare your customers are, especially in markets where there's a high degree of multiple SIM usage. But let's continue with our analysis. So we've looked at resources and competencies that are valuable. We've looked at whether they're rare. We then look at how costly they would be to imitate. Now, creating or establishing a similar brand to somebody like Vodafone would be extremely costly. So clearly that's going to get a tick in the box. That's going to get a yes. And acquiring customers, winning customers in the market, that's also extremely expensive. And so customers is another costly to imitate resource, and building out a fixed network can also be very costly. And so the final category is to ask the question, well, does the organization exploit it well enough? So here we have some big questions. Brand, well, most telcos are not too bad at leveraging their brand, but they probably don't command the same brand equity as they used to. With customers, one of the big challenges for telecoms companies is that their customer base and the knowledge and the insight that they have into their customers is actually one of their most powerful and valuable resources. But regulation often prevents them from exploiting that insight for financial gain. So often they aren't in a position to exploit their customer base. Finally, there's the issue of fixed and converged networks. And it is often the case that when you talk to a mobile operator with both a fixed and mobile network, and you ask them, are you able to provide a single bill to your customer with both their fixed and mobile billing on it? They often say, well, we haven't quite got to that stage yet. And telecoms companies, unfortunately, are often very bad at the cross-selling of fixed to mobile and mobile to fixed. So often, telecoms companies are not perhaps leveraging that convergence as well as they would like. So once again, you can see why the telecoms industry is finding it difficult to deliver return on capital employed, because they are struggling to find resources and competencies that can provide a source of competitive advantage. Let's just summarize that. So if you've got no valuable resources or competencies, then you are going to be at a competitive disadvantage. If you've got valuable resources but they're not rare, then you will be on a competitive parity with your competitors. If you've got valuable assets, valuable resources and competencies that are also rare, but your competitors can easily replicate them, then you will have a short-term source of competitive advantage. And only when we get a yes in all of those boxes, where something is rare, it is valuable and costly to imitate, then that's where you may have a source of sustainable competitive advantage. And it's very difficult to find a business that meets all of those criteria. So in fact, the way a telecoms business may succeed in the future is by being very good at finding short-term sources of competitive advantage, leveraging them as much as they can, and then quickly moving on to the next idea while your competitors catch up and replicate them. So that is the VRIO framework. It's one of my favorite analytical tools. And when we come back, we're going to look at yet more material from Michael Porter, Porter's generic strategies.
Need to know more? Why not visit our store, where you can choose from over 200 hours of video-based training. Alternatively, you can contact us to discuss any specific training requirements you may have.